Welcome everyone to this special session in our lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Epistemic Resistance. My name is Diego Ballestero and I will be serving as your moderator today. We are privileged to host an urgent conversation with the brilliant and committed thinker and anti-colonial activist Sabine Broeck. This conversation that we are going to have is organized by the COCO, the Colonial Research Group, which is a group of researchers, students, and artists from different disciplines developing the colonial thought since 2019, currently based in Berlin, who are strongly against the unfolding genocide in Palestine. And this session, I will put forward some questions to open this dialogue with Sabine, and then we are going to open the floor for questions and answers round from the audience. Please be reminded that this session will be recorded for educational purpose and for later dissemination. And now let me please introduce our wonderful speaker today. We are honored to have Sabine Broeck with us today. She's one of the most important critical voices within the anti-colonial and decolonial debate coming from Germany, and one of the very few brave voices in German academia speaking out loud against the atrocities committed against the Palestinian people and of German complicity on the ongoing genocide. She has not only several outstanding achievements as a scholar, but also as an intellectual militant, participating in social, political, and intellectual movements since her youth, when she took part of the great social movements of the generation of the 1968, and struggles she will further talk about also in this conversation. Dr. Sabine Broeck is Professor Emerita of the Faculty of Modern Literature at the University of Bremen in Germany. She teaches American Studies, Gender Studies, and Transatlantic Black Diaspora Studies. Her widely published research critiques the coloniality and anti-blackness of transatlantic modernity as a social formation and culture of enslavism. She was president of the international scholarly organization Collegium for African American Research from 2017 to 2015, as well as founding member and director of the University of Bremen Institute for Postcolonial and Transcultural Studies for many years until 2015. She's an author of very important monographs such as the Entkolonisierte Koerper from 1988 and White Amnesia-Black Memory, American Women's Writing and History from 1999, and Gender and the Abjection of Blackness with SUNY Press from 2019. We are extremely thankful to her for accepting having this special conversation with us. So thank you very much, Sabine. And I would like to start this conversation by asking you about the German academic context. The first question is, Germany is definitely a place where there is a systematic practice of institutional silencing of critics of Israel. But something that we as foreign thinkers find more shocking is that there is a general lack of criticism also pervades the decolonial German thinkers and the left-wing thinkers more broadly. What is going on with the colonial and leftist German thinker, and why don't they speak out in the face of an obvious genocide? And how do we get from militant anti-fascists in the 60s and 70s to the state of Israel being a state raison?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, the COCO activists and friends for the invitation. The honor is all mine. And thank you, Diego, for your very generous introduction. It's interesting to be read as an activist again. So it's very inspiring. I begin my answer to the first question by saying a few sentences first to actually begin again with Palestine. It is today the 6th of June, 2024. Gaza is annihilated. 1.5 million surviving men, women, children, old, young, intellectuals, journalists, doctors, business people, shop owners, lawyers, teachers, singers, dancers, painters, poets, professors, you name it. They are all being bomb chased through the strip by the IDF with nowhere to go. In my Twitter feed, tweeting colleagues, friends and loose acquaintances, we have found each other by way of tweeting and retweeting our shared disgust and rage, but also by way of admissions of our own helplessness vis-à-vis the broadcasted killing fields. We are running out of adjectives. So much protest, militant or not, has happened, all those big and small events of solidarity we have witnessed as a global outpour of solidarity with Palestine. So there's global outrage, but Germany? When I wrote my blog for Mass Review in November 2023, Staatsräson had just announced itself in statements by our Bundeskanzler and by all prominent members of our government and parliament, like Habeck, Baerbock, and so many others, irrespective of their party loyalties. There has been an avalanche of Staatsräson attacks supported across the political spectrum, often mobilized and headed by representatives of the Deutsche Israelische Gesellschaft and the journal Jüdische Allgemeine, and by Zionist factions of Jewish communities in Germany, including youth groups and leaders at the university and elsewhere. And it pains me to say that the post-68 generation, meaning my generation, has, in the shape of the Green Party, now taken over not only state power, but also its presumed reason and the adhering willingness to exercise it. In fact, Staatsräson, in my view, has evolved from being a noun, a concept coined for certain kinds of direct political power of the state, to a liberal leftist verb, a daily practice of dissemination, to a doing the business of the state, in many cases entirely unbidden. And make a mental note, because I think that's going to be like my main points for the discussion later, this movement from noun to verb, from concept to practice. We have seen an avalanche of incidents on a daily basis, creating erosion and resignation and fear by way of constant barrages of intimidation, cancellations, police interventions on unis against encampments, press slander, the entire arsenal gone hysterical. We feel dizziness, panic. We encounter silence and evasion or downright hostility among people we have known as friends or colleagues. We share resistance messaging on social media. That means a barrage of messages, efforts at networking that was kept for reasons of fear, I think, way too loose and nameless to be effective against Staatsräson, operating almost clandestinely, and thus could not become a public focus. We have not seen one massive central event in solidarity with Palestine organized by German academics. The Palestine Congress, organized by Palestinians and Jewish leftists, not necessarily in academic positions, was promptly scandalized as terrorist anti-Semitism. Jewish left organizations have offered leadership, local and national Palestinian groups have organized demonstrations week after week. And anti-colonial students have taken the lead in Berlin and other places. But the German liberal leftist public remains undisturbed. So indeed, how have we gotten to the point of Staatsräson reigning supreme and being met with either fearful local events, tactical circumvention, or outright refusal to raise critical voices? My latest example, which really got me, was that when the Stark-Watzinger, the Bildungsminister, started attacking protests in the Bild-Zeitung, which is unheard of, basically. There was not like, I mean, there were articles, but you would have expected like a massive outcry, like rising sort of nationally, and that didn't happen. So a whole slew of articles has by now been published in the US, European outlets, and Germany about the pro-state of Israel mobilization of German guilt. So I want to remember crucial stations of this trajectory of how we got there. I remember anti-fascism as a severely attacked, maligned, and prosecuted militant international struggle against the remainders of fascism in Germany and other European societies, and against emerging restoration of racial capitalist repression within and by the welfare state and international war regimes. So, for example, can you or we even imagine today demonstrations against war in Germany, like the demonstrations against Vietnam, running with the slogan USA, SA, SS? I do remember Berufsverbote, so the effort to cleanse schools and universities of people who were sort of committed activists, or sometimes they weren't even, just assumed to be. So Berufsverbote as the enforcement of anti-communist hysteria, political repression against presumed enemies of the state and against people considered their allies. So the kind of the German version of McCarthyism. I do remember the prosecution of RAF terrorism in the Bleierne Zeit in the 1970s, a rather desperate politics enacted mainly by people who had been disillusioned in their peaceful anti-fascist struggles, a successful state campaign of criminalization and pathologization against the politics of violence itself and against all assumed Sympathisanten. I don't know who remembers that word, Sympathisanten, sort of the people who were said to sympathize with the RAF. As a kind of late result of the aggressive isolation of the more militant parts of the post-68 left, the Green Party enters parliament in 1983, boosted by high hopes for democratic representation and majority white movements against nuclear power and for women's and queer rights, a new bourgeoisie in the making. And what happened to anti-fascism? Again, I remember the Weizsäcker speech 1985, which recast the 8th of May, the day of the capitulation of the Nazi regime to the Allied forces, as a day of liberation over and against the reactionary framework of national surrender. A speech which needs to be read as a double gesture of admission of guilt, but also of a re-articulation of a German national body as quasi self-redeemed by its acceptance of this guilt. I remember the Historikerstreit from 1987, leading to an explicit polarization between a mainstream liberal public, which cast the admission of Holocaust shame as a normative consensus for a Germany that was finally re-emerging as a morally acceptable, if not even model-like international player against an organized reformation of the political right. And Habermas played a role in that too, so I will come back to Habermas in a second. Right-wing historians like Ernst Nolte had published an article that framed the Holocaust as Hitler's response to Stalinism. Okay, and Habermas, who I will get to in a minute, played a decisive role in this year-long controversy in his express critique of what he called historical revisionism, a critique which insisted on the acknowledgement of responsibility and guilt as a chance for a new German identity, sort of proactively self-apologizing. And I do remember the Bitburg cemetery scandal when Kohl and the US President Reagan visited Waffen-SS graves. One of the moves to launch Holocaust denial by right-wing think tanks like the still existing secret Georgekreis, sorry. So I'm just sort of dropping these things here because there's no time to go into the details, but you get the idea that there's so much stuff to look at if we really want to get close to understanding what's been going on for the last half year. So even though seen in hindsight, the intense and volatile controversy platformed a germinal condensation of right-wing intellectual discourse, which has since become ever more rabid. In those years, the liberal articulations of the Holocaust being codified in what Max Czolek called Gedächtnistheater were winning the day for the time being, making Germany good again and liberating us from guilt by public memory campaigns to establish German responsibility and repentance, verbal repentance at least, for the Shoah. And the point is, I think, that this whole Gedächtnistheater in fact installed a kind of sort of typical German arrogant gesture of that we try to redeem ourselves. So like, because, you know, the discussion in Australia about the Excuse Us campaign that the indigenous population started, the point was always like, you can't excuse yourself. You know, you ask for, you know, being excused, or redemption is something that if it happens, will have to be given, but you can't sort of declare yourself redeemed. But I think that's what this performativity of remembrance did, and that's why it could become this teleological national narrative, because it was so seductive as this self-exoneration. So within a span of 2 generations, we moved to an amply professional national pro-Israelism as our exoneration. And I think this whole thing about profession is interesting here, like something that people felt called upon to profess and to perform, like in all kinds of civic situations. So there are some more strands to follow, which would call for more attention beyond this conversation today. I think we need to trace more carefully the trajectory of the so-called Anti-Deutsche, or Hyperdeutsche, as I would call them, who were rooted in an anti-national extra-parliamentary left after and against German reunification, which is a bonus that they still profit from among young people, who have skidded into a Hyperdeutsch abusive practice of weaponizing actually existing anti-Jewish violence and hatred on the right in order to undermine a critique of Israel as settler colonial state as anti-Semitic, and to strategically insert their agent provocateur interventions against Palestine solidarity. And more attention, by the way, needs to be paid to their other investments, for example, in anti-trans and anti-feminist politics, which is largely overlooked. That, I mean, Palestine is not their only problem. And the other thing would be that we need a more detailed picture of the post-war generation's relations to Israel and the trajectories of both philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism on the left, and of relations of the left to Palestine, as well as Germany's economic and military ties. So what I want to say is, I think that it becomes sort of clearer by the week that it's almost like Germany has been missing the bus for decades. Like there's so much stuff that happened that hasn't been reflected upon or criticized or even worked through as a kind of historiographic narrative. There's just like so much self-contentment with the self-exoneration narrative that, and I think everyone here will know that from talking to friends, that the lack of knowledge is just sort of breathtaking. Yeah, so that was the answer to the first question.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And related with this question, it's indeed very interesting to see how anti-imperialism here has almost totally been shoved to the margins, mostly in favor of these white saviors, NGOs. So we can also see that kind of slipping into the right wing in the parliamentary system. Groups such as the Green Party have ended up being completely complicit in war mongering. Was this also an effect of the reunification and renationalization, and why has this happened?
So I think it is important to see the pejorative attacks on post-colonial critique that somehow condense this kind of anti-imperialism, to see that as an international coherent rollback, which has started decades ago with the early attacks on so-called political correctness, with the political and intellectual aggression against post-civil rights movements gains in Black studies programs in the US, through the post-9/11 campaigns against critical race theory, and just mentioning champions of this trend here like Christopher Rufo, but there are so many others. But a trend going all the way back to the founders of the moral majority in 1979, like Jerry Falwell and the like. So this international campaign has a history that will have to be written. And again, the key word here is international and organized, because I think that's another thing that people are not sufficiently aware of. What happens in the academic realm to me is in perfect mutual concert with the political isolation and cultural discreditation of African and other third world liberation movements after the end of the Cold War, and with neoliberal takeover of white empathy discourses by way of organized and often highly capitalized white savior NGOs. One could argue that a shift has been mobilized from radical political analysis to cultural tourism and multicultural affect as a kind of socially engaged versions of ethno-chic, which had its outliers in rather scattered strands in academic projects and seminars, like the occasional seminar on Chinua Achebe in English departments, and a very small number of notoriously understaffed post-colonial studies in English or other language departments. And to be clear, to this day, to my knowledge, there's not a single Black Studies program in Germany. Some concerted effort to seriously address German coloniality in the last decade, like at the University of Hamburg Center for Colonial Research, thus came with a huge time lag and has remained underfunded and isolated from mainstream Geisteswissenschaften mired in European white humanism's tenets, and is entirely dependent on the financial and ethical grace of rather meager and always embattled state support under the aegis of diversity claims. Thus, the recently orchestrated hysteria of the German mainstream press discourse, including in Swiss and Austrian venues, which, as if steered by commando, is a rather violent chimera of post-colonial critique reigning universities for slander and of the post-colonial critique reigning universities. So it's a campaign for slander and a fabricated outraged indignation at recent historical research about the massive political, economic, and military investments of the German state in and with the state of Israel. Next question.
Thank you. Yeah. So now we are in a context not only in Germany but worldwide, where criticism of Israel is quickly equated with anti-Semitism. But in Germany, specifically, the culture of memory of the Holocaust has been instrumentalized by elites to unconditionally support Israel, regardless of its policies. Is in such a way, some of the voices that German memory culture finds more uncomfortable belong precisely to the kind of views the Nazis hated most: radical leftists, diasporic, cosmopolitan, internationalized, and opposed to all ethno-national states, including a Jewish one. Is that the direction we should point out to, if there are still pockets of radical leftist practice? And what role should then the critical radical negativity play with respect to, for example, the analysis of state power?
Yes, I have been thinking for weeks now about this issue of radical negativity. And I want to take a specific tack for today to address that. And of course, I'm sure that might not exhaust the problematic. And that is to stress the fact of what I call a kind of post-Habermasian-induced leftist helplessness. I think we have witnessed a swift trajectory of nationalization of white leftist politics, from rebellion and anti-imperialist solidarity to the national Erlösungserzählung, to democratic civility via Habermas, and to the Green Party becoming part of the state so rapidly enforced Staatsräson. So what I'm saying is that Staatsräson is a project much older than post-October 7, 2023, and that the current aggressive mobilization of it is so successful because the call for unconditional solidarity with Israel provides but a perfectly stageable platform for the political, cultural, and social realization of the continuous inscription and incorporation of the German liberal left into state politics. So it's been going on for a long time, but it's almost as if the neoliberal state has been sort of waiting for or moving towards finding this platform that would eventually bind like an entire generation, including previously critical people or more critical people, into this conglomerate of Staatsräson as a practice. So I think the theoretical problem that we are facing is that for these reasons of this Erlösungserzählung, there's no longer like state analysis. So what I mean, an analysis of the monopoly of power lodged in the state, so that people don't look at the state, never mind which political party is running it, as a kind of opponent or antagonist to their demands, but they look at the state as a kind of civically founded institution that they can almost treat with good faith. So, it's another way of saying, like, Marxist analysis has certainly been extremely marginalized, but not only Marxist, but even radical feminist analysis had like a state analysis like some decades ago. So, and I think that has a lot to do with Jürgen Habermas' influence on that generation, and specifically with his notion of deliberation. Which, I mean, I checked and I can't read all these quotes because it's too long, but it's actually quite sort of forward aggressive in the way that he invents this term of, or he doesn't invent it, he's taking it from other people, but he forwards this idea of deliberation as a strategy to live his idea of sort of the democratic public and of the Bürgergesellschaft. But in fact, I think deliberation is a strategy to exclude and forego and isolate or override antagonism and negativity as a kind of radical critique. So in my view, the hegemony of deliberation as a kind of political, social, cultural ideal has facilitated widespread liberal and activist confusion, which is the actual belief that the state can and should be not only the addressee, but the guarantee of claims to secure civil rights politics by way of negotiating and framing and funding all kinds of anti-racist, feminist, queer, and decolonial grassroots educational projects, and creating a very widespread dependency on state funding. So you want to do something different or critical, or but then you ask the state to finance it, because you are bound into the structure of deliberation where everything can be negotiated without like struggle, basically, and without the notion of antagonism between, you know, people's protest and the state ever coming into view. So the problem I see is that the state's gracing of movements with tactical and opportunistic policies of welcoming diversity and even integrating a measure of anti-racist critique into public discourse, if not actual political change, for example, giving us positions in universities, that tactics has furthered instead of massively disrupted the project of Germany as a white European good nation. So there's this Erlösungsnarrativ and this sort of national becoming, and then that is mobilized by this idea that we can negotiate about everything. So while more radical grassroots mobilizations like environmental struggles, for example, the resistance against the Tesla factory, anti-fascism on the ground, abolitionist campaigns against racial profiling and police violence are being isolated and slandered and ostracized, or in a rising number of cases even prosecuted by the law, this combination of in and excorporation by deliberation has been mobilized by and mobilizes in turn an almost complete dedication or even surrender to so-called realpolitik. And I think, yeah, that might have broken our necks already, but next question.
Yeah, and so in this context where fascists are not only already sending police dogs to attack young people, as is happening with Bremen students in Kettman recently, but also to a certain extent succeeding in organizing people's frustration along ethno-nationalist lines, how can the left or the progressive movements reconstruct a sense of solidarity and clarity that effectively competes with these narratives? And we've seen in the universities and encampments worldwide how the students remember everybody that is about Gaza in the first place, but not only about Gaza. It's about Sudan, it's about Congo, it's about fighting police repression, fighting white supremacy, the military complex, and so on. So there are signs of where we should go, but at the same time, we watch the capitalization of social unrest by conservative forces. So if we address our current situation not as a crisis, but as an ongoing apocalypse, in the words of Bedou Alagra, how could we possibly organize this? And how can we build effective solidarities within such diverse group of the oppressors, so to speak?
Well, big questions, and I'm not sure I have like answers, but I want to say something. So first, let me stress that it wasn't the fascists that have sent police with dogs on the Bremen students, because if that had been the case, the lines would be hard but very clear. So the current rectorate at University of Bremen consists of 4 almost middle-aged white women and 1 white male academic who are fully representing the diversity, tolerance, and deliberation discourse in their programmatic pronouncements on the website, for example. The challenge now will be to act concertedly precisely in those moments where and when radical antagonistic protest, or what is even being seen as such, like what the students did in Bremen, interrupts this discourse, and it starts fraying at its seams to the extent of calling in state violence. But the problem is at this point that I can see no forms of sustainable, wider intersectional organization available, because the historical trajectories and connections to previous militant mobilizations have been evacuated. And I think that for all the gains in civility that the post-68 generations, green and feminist and queer and multicultural social politics, even in their intersectional articulations, achieved in welfare state Germany, even for all that, we now have to confront the challenge of organizing internationalist, radical anti-colonial and anti-war struggle against the nation state and against the emerging continental alliance as a kind of supranational entity in the Frontex defense of white Europe. So big, big, big. In this context, which versions of abolition might help and which remain, given the inevitable crackdowns of state violence, which ones remain mired in idealist approaches to local improvements? That seems an urgent debate to me, which I think we need to have in modes different from telegram lists and decentralized, scattered discussions. So that's another important point for me, that I'm quite restless with the way things have moved away from sort of some kind of verbindliche Strukturen, as we Germans would say, like committed structures, to all this kind of loose networking via the internet, which is very, what's the word, diffusive. So for example, practical steps, if I address academia, which is sort of my own territory, as it were, I would bring in Césaire's work, The Black Critique of Humanism and Coloniality, and Toscano's Late Fascism. To quote Lisa Lowe, liberal democracy is not fascism's antidote, but rather its condition of possibility. So what could that mean for a politics in universities on the ground? And I think it's urgent that we no longer shield the rudimentary post-colonial and, some decolonial instances of critique in Germany in a defensive and at times even apologetic manner, but we should raise the bar, demand anti-colonial, anti-fascist education focused on a long overdue critique of German myopic constructions of its post-World War II identity and its consequences. And I literally mean that. I mean, I think it'd be great if we could figure out how to organize a national campaign for an entirely different kinds of humanities at the universities that are focused on this kind of anti-colonial, anti-fascist program, like a major league consciousness raising for the next 10 years. So that would still be just a tiny political puzzle piece to work towards a larger, open and unforgiving mobilization against Staatsräson. But as we know, all politics are local. So last question.
It will be a beautiful utopia to have certain kind of, I need to say it. So finally, when we invite you, you choose the slogan Vogliamo Tutto. We want everything for the title of your talk, bringing back the struggle of the late 60s and 60s. So what does it mean to say vis-a-vis the aggressive power of the fascist right in Europe and elsewhere, Vogliamo Tutto, we want everything? And who could be that we from an anti-imperialistic perspective, since we are not all in the same boat from the very beginning?
Yeah, how? How then could the grandiosity of Vogliamo Tutto open a horizon? And I think actually I did that very consciously, because part of me thinks that we lack a lot of things, but we also lack that kind of anti-state utopia. Like we're really always too mired in defensive, reactive kinds of politics. So why Vogliamo Tutto? We want everything. If you begin with the movement for system change, meaning tutto, everything, then you have a chance to sort of negotiate down and implement steps like, for example, symbolic decolonial action with renaming street names, or even money for school books, or even more pronounced an interdiction of racial profiling. So what I'm saying is, if we start like with wanting all, then we have leeway to say, okay, for now we do this and then we call for all again and so on. But if you begin with small change appellations to the state as is, in the long run, you gamble away the chances for anti-colonial and anti-fascist system change. So that it's almost like, you go on a bazaar and you say like, the guy says, well, you want to pay, and you say like very little, then of course, then he has to raise you. Whereas if you already start with, so the question is this kind of give and take between what should our demands be and how far should they think ahead and how utopian should they be, so that then you can say, okay, like, of course we can't do the revolution tomorrow, but we work towards this instead of having given it up and being stranded in realpolitik before you even start doing something. And of course, this sounds entirely utopian. And we, whatever that is, are utterly unprepared for social and political struggles on the level that rising European fascism will bring us to. It's not even clear who the we will be. And I was hoping like we could talk about this, because I certainly can't answer that as an individual. My point is not that we should fall back into sectarianism and sling around slogans of the working class making a revolution subito or some such. My point is that resistance to Staatsräson will have to build the organization. So that's another big thing for the discussion, this whole issue of organization. It will have to be anti-white power, international, intersectionally composed, and financially independent of the state. Very important. I want to, at the end, I want to bring in the late Mike Davis's clairvoyance and ask what it could mean for us to realize that only under the shelter of each other we will survive. So how do we do that? How do we build the shelter? Thank you.
That was a powerful answer. And with that powerful answer, that was the last question from our side. So we open the floor now for the people in the room to ask some questions to our wonderful speaker. Before that, I want to thank you for this wonderful conversation, Sabine. So please, people, it was a pleasure. So people, please feel free to have Sabine here. So please feel free to ask. And I hope that someone is oh, we have here. So I'm going to raise this question. Sorry, people. It's in the questions and answer. So Sarah Naira, she asked, could you kindly repeat the titles of the books you mentioned? Late Fashions by Toscano, Alberto, and what was the other? Thank you very much.
I don't know. Maybe the Bedouin Abadra.
Yeah, maybe we can put it on the.
I think I will figure out the title at this point. I think it's something about the ongoing apocalypse, but I have to write it.
Yeah,
but I don't know if that was the book you meant. Whoever asked the question.
Yeah, then we are going, Sarah, we are going to find out the reference, and we're going to put it on the chat. Now, Hosna Rege, thank you so much, Sabine. I find your discussion of the effect of a politic of deliberation compelling. I agree that we must raise the bar of anti-colonial, anti-fascist organized and education. In the USA, the problem is compounded by the liberal left fear of engaging in a thoroughgoing critique of the state in the face of the extreme right anti-state, anti-deep state position. So people committed to true diversity, equity, and inclusion are afraid to criticize the incorporation of DEI programs into state politics because these programs and policies are under attack by the right. So they refrain from critique from their perspective, thereby setting the ground to the right. And now comes the question, how do we begin to enter the fray again, given the precarity of these programs in the academic context?
Yeah, Josna, you caught me. I don't have a good answer because I think it will also depend on specific situations where it might have sort of some kind of tactical wisdom not to push the point, and other situations where if you have a real mass movement built up to actually sort of go for it. But in general, my feeling would be that, and I'm saying that as a German who has grown up with her lecture in how, you know, the fascist state in the 30s came into power, that sort of giving into realpolitik is the surest way to lose. So if you don't have an alternative to point out, because you're afraid to say it, then that leaves the territory entirely to the right. I'm not sure if that's really what you were going for, but I can just like think of an answer, for example, when like with all these austerity politics these days, there, you know, everybody is talking about, you know, like getting out of migration, like, you know, good migration politics and cutting down on the welfare state, etc. And then I think the anger against this is left to the right. But if there was a leftist group or a larger leftist movement, even better to say, well, you know, the migrants are not your enemy, and you know, the unemployed people are not your enemies, but the enemy is sort of racial capital. And so we come in against this with the suggestion, for example, to tax Amazon and the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, it won't immediately happen, but somebody will have to say it. And I think the problem we have now is that these kinds of radical alternative suggestions are nowhere in the discourse because we keep defending ourselves. But I don't know if that answered your question.
So if not, they can ask again. I have three questions. Okay, I go with the question from Sasha, recalling one of our questions. And he said, in a context where fascists are succeeding in organizing people's frustration along ethno-national lines, how can the left in Germany and elsewhere reconstruct a sense of solidarity and clarity that effectively competes with this narrative without falling into the trap of scapegoating certain groups?
Yeah, and to me, it always comes back to this question of organization, because I think it's not that there aren't people in the German left in the, you know, in the widest sense. Like there are all these pro-migration initiatives. There are all these people who do rescue work in the Mediterranean. There are like church communities who offer asylum to, you know, sans-papier people, etc., etc. But I think the success of neoliberalism has been to completely scatter these struggles. And the only voice that is sort of in the public discourse is the voice of deliberation. So, and I guess we will have to start very small, but you know, how could we even start thinking about, for example, calling for an actual physical meeting of activists from all over Europe that is not bound into any party politics of the Greens or the left or whatever, to give ourselves some kind of program? And how do you then build a structure towards that being not like a momentary high point gesture, like not just show? So what I think my answer to you is that it's a matter of content, but it's also really a matter of the mode of politics I think we have to get back to or towards. Okay. So
I have another question from Sasha, but I go to move to Sasha, if you agree, I go to move to a really small question from Sarah Naira. He wrote, Black Critique something, I think the book titled Stars. You recommend this book as a practical step for academia? Critique of the Black reason, maybe? Or no?
No. I said Black studies. I think I suggested Césaire and wait. I mean, there's tons of books. These were just examples. Let me see. Yeah, I said Césaire's work and Black Critique of Humanism and Coloniality. And so that I could make a list of those books and then like somehow distribute them, not like at the top of my head, but there's, you know, I mean, just like next week or even tomorrow, there's a discussion between Ruthie Gilmore, who has been one of the leading proponents of Black abolition, radical abolitionism, with Alberto Toscano. It's in Portugal and it's not on Zoom, but I would love to be able to be there because I think that's exactly the convergences that we need. And then the other person I suggested was Lisa Lowe. And that quote that I read about liberalism as fascism's condition of possibility is in a review she just wrote about Toscano's book, which I have already posted on the DeCoco list, I think, but we can.
You can send us and then we can distribute with.
Yeah, maybe we can like create this little document, or I don't know, but.
This is a great idea. So I move from to a question from Jorge. He wrote, from the Islamophobic perspective in Germany, Islam must be controlled because it's supposedly fundamentalist. This, among other things, demonstrates the enormous ignorance that exists in Europe about the history of Islam. But here in Germany, voices that do not follow the state's dogma are persecuted. Can there be anything more fundamentalist? It reproduced the Orientalists of accusing the Muslim population of being violent while providing weapons to burn children. Can there be anything more violent? It seems that everything Germany accuses its enemies of exactly what it does. How long can Germany maintain this cognitive dissonance?
Well, as long as nobody is going to seriously disrupt it, I guess. I mean, another like very recent example of this is the Hertha Müller article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I don't know if any of you have seen this. It was titled, I can't imagine a world without, I mean, it was in German. I can't imagine a world without Israel, or I don't want to imagine a world without Israel. And it's sort of like a whole page in the FATS, and it's really a masterclass. And I say master here, like, purposefully, in Islamophobia and the wildest and crudest hatred of, everything Arabic and Islam. And I mean, I don't know if I should even say that publicly, but I wish we could have a state of affairs by which the next thing that happens would be like, a group of students visiting the FATS offices and demand like a disclaimer or demand a critique. So, and I think that just speaks to what I'm saying, that we need like less deliberative and less processual and less non-antagonistic forms of struggle to have some more entry into the territories that are constantly sort of built against us. Jorge, I don't know if...
I'm sure that he's happy with this beautiful answer. So I have an answer from Kenny. How to oppose white power in European nation states, often founded in parallel to white imperialism?
Yeah, same thing, right? I mean, I don't think there's white power without imperialism and vice versa. So, and again, it's hard to imagine anything beyond the state of scattered that, anti-imperialists and, Black activists and decolonial activists are in. But maybe it's not impossible, again, to think about making more proactive connections with, say, the resistance, the Black resistance to Paris politics in France, or, in Spain and Portugal, where the demographics are sort of not so white, and you have sort of different generations of Black leadership already, which is like one of the big problems, I think, in Germany, that like any kind of Black knowledges and Black interventions are so extremely isolated on all levels. I mean, theoretically and also on the activist level. And the point I want to stress again is this whole idea of how do we go back to forms of organization that are not financially dependent on the state? Like, Because if you want to think about building really like organizations of solidarity, you cannot ask for Drittmittel to finance them. That's sort of a contradiction in terms. And I think it's a mindset that people outside the academic left have probably always known, but since the left is so overdetermined, at least in Germany, by, you know, the academic environment, it seems that the whole question of these kinds of, you know, quote unquote guerrilla academics have completely sort of vanished. So you organize a Drittmittelantrag to get 2,000 euro to organize a conference, instead of thinking about how could you put up, like, you know, 20 people with your friends and cook food together. So, I mean, that's really the level on which I'm thinking about these things. Like,
yeah. I have another question for Vidant. I hope that I pronounced the name correctly. How do you view application of arrest warrant against Israeli cabinet as an attempt of decolonization of International Criminal Court, given the court hyper-focus on African leaders and ignorance of crimes committed by European and American leaders? Also, how do you view international criminal law as a tool for decolonization, given its potency and the jurisprudential objectivity it possesses?
I don't think the International Court is any decolonial tool, period. I mean, I think like whatever they decide could be made useful in anti-colonial struggle tactically. But the only reason that the international courts now have come out with these, you know, decisions against Israel is because of global mass struggles that we have witnessed the last months, not because they also already all of a sudden found it in their good hearts, or because they were converted to colonial analysis, because something had to happen to uphold even their own like meager standards of, you know, humanity. So my relation would be entirely tactical.
Okay, I have a question from Karina. Thank you so much for such an engaging talk. I would like to ask, what is the role of anti-Palestinian races in statism?
Yeah, like I said before, I mean, I think that this kind of twin pairing of sort of pro-state of Israel with anti-Palestinian ressentiment and Islamophobia is a perfect platform for, you know, all the upholders of Staatsräson to bind the left into this guilt complex. It's almost like if it hadn't happened, it needed to be invented, because in Germany, the entry into this surrender is so, it's this mixture of, you know, state pressure by intimidation and prosecution and seduction and the promise of being the good people. And I think that's not to be underestimated, because who doesn't want to be the good person? So if you have entire generations who have grown up with learning in school and everywhere you go in every public discourse that siding with Israel makes you the good person, then it's very easy for the state sort of to move into that space and say, okay, and now we want that, you know, we want to see that realized and we want to enforce it. And then the problem is that they find all these willing, you know, people who then Staatsräson other people. And I think that works on so many levels, like within friendships, within, you know, collegial professional situations, on the political level. Sometimes I think probably we'd be surprised, like whatever, for example, in the city of Bremen, who decided that they need to invite the ambassador of the state of Israel. Like, we don't know at this point how many people were against it, because none of this will be sort of, you know, publicly be admitted because everybody wants to be the good German. But it's not impossible to find out. So maybe if we had a little more, I don't know, daring also to go into these situations and confront people. Like, for example, when the Bremen students were sort of cleansed from the campus with police and, you know, even dogs. That's what I said before, that there's this kind of, you know, this kind of liberal politics is fraying at the seams, and this kind of Erpressung, like blackmailing, has holes. So what happened was that, you know, a group of colleagues who are not necessarily like reading Palestine the same way that I'd be reading it, and who also might not have, you know, that kind of radical critiques of Israel, but they were infuriated by the fact that these liberal rectorate members called the dogs and the police on the students. And that's like a crack that, you know, then like if we had more radical organization, you could sort of step into that crack. But since we don't have it, oftentimes it's where this rests. Like, you know, the discussion is not being pushed.
We have a question from an anonymous participant. How much do you think the loss of the counterweight to the Western capitalists represented by the Soviet bloc and the consequent victory over socialists as an alternative model contributes to the rise of Israel as an state reason for the Federal Republic of Germany?
Can we have a seminar about that? I don't know if I can answer that. I can't answer that in detail with respect to the immediate effects on the state of Israel, other than the speculation that, you know, if we had a different kind of Russia, it might be like more expressly supporting Palestine. So that's one effect I see. But in general, what I can say is I think that you know, what Fukuyama described as the end of history. So when like the Cold War finally collapsed or moved into a different stage, I think the problem is that a lot of people saw that as a kind of liberating movement of the kinds of tensions and contradictions and unresolved problems of that the Cold War had produced. But I think, and then in that vein, you have all these, you know, welfare state liberal movements sort of springing into that moment, like feminism and queer studies and queer politics. And I think what was lost is this kind of almost like the Soviet Union being a placeholder for a larger kind of pressure. So that African states sort of in the shadow of the Soviet Union, for example, could sort of successfully liberate their countries. But then once these two blocs sort of dissolved, and Russian politics also changed, that kind of framework was lost.
We have another question from Biran, and asks, can you expand upon the idea of Islam as a race to justify the atrocities committed against Palestinians? I am from India, and the Hindutva nationalist groups are supporting Zionists through further vilifying Islam and Muslims.
Yeah, I don't think Islam is a race, and whoever wants to bring that up, I mean, it's just one of these fascist inventions. And I think Islam, most of all, is not homogenic. Is that the word? Like, I mean, it's not like one thing. So there's like very conservative ultra right-wing Islam, and then there's very radical leftist Islam. And especially, I think, in the Arab world in the last 10 years, we have seen how massive the struggle between these different factions are. So for me, maybe I wouldn't want to so much think about Islam as one thing, but more about the problem of, you know, the various justifications that the powers that be find for their ethnic nation states and their ethnic nation states violence and sort of rabid kind of aggression against their own minorities or other countries. So, and in that respect, I think there's sort of a very close connection, you know, between Trump and Modi and Bolsonaro and, you know, some Arab states and the Iran. And so that's sort of, I think, one of our problems in the future, like how does one create terms that you can even talk about the world's problems outside these nation states agendas? And how do you sort of gain hegemony over, for example, the discourse of freedom of religion or climate change or women's rights or whatever that are out from under these nation state tactical and opportunistic interests?
Yeah. I have a question, and so during your great talk, I was taking some notes, and so I wrote this question: if the German state is projecting anti-Semitism onto racialized communities to cover up his own anti-Semitism, how can these communities and their allies resist this narrative without falling into the trap of being labeled anti-Semitism while maintaining their solidarity with Palestine?
I think they will be labeled, I mean, you know, we just have to suffer through it. I don't think there's a way to avoid it. I think we can just keep on insisting on that, you know, ethics is with us and political reason is with us and, you know, historical truth in a way is with us. I mean, there's no way that if Palestinians and other communities are keeping on the struggle, that they will be labeled. And so probably you can, depending on what the state of Israel will do, you can have some kind of small gains in, like if I go by what the talks I have with my friends who at the beginning couldn't understand why I would come out pro-Palestine at all. And now they're at the point that they're saying, well, you know, this has been carrying on for way too long and the Palestinians need relief. And so again, that's like really small cracks. But I think it might even get worse. Like, if you think at this perverse coalition between the militant right-wing fascist factions in Europe, like in France and in Germany and Hungary, and the way that they side with Israel, you know, for purely, I mean, they are the biggest anti-Semites. So I think there's just no choice other than pointing it out again and again and again, and then building defenses, like building, you know, good crowdfunding, building a system of lawyers, you know, building organization again to just create this shelter, because individuals will be hard hit if they remain individuals in this.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So with that powerful final remark, we are going to close this conversation, this session. It's been a pleasure for all us. And we want to thank you again, Sabine, for your wonderful participation. And to thank you, the public present today, for the interest in this conversation. Before we go, please don't forget to follow up the work of the Coco Collective at the website, thecoco.net, and their social medias. So once again, thank you very much, Sabine. Thank you to all of you, and see you next time.
Thank you for all your engaged questions. It was really, I mean, it's not pleasurable subjects, but it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Also necessary.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.